So I'm going to make a series of video on what I learned from Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith in the 1700s. Yeah, let's start with the first book of Wealth of Nations, book one. Well, actually, there are 5 books in this entire bigger book, and each book has a different focus. The focus of the first book, in the words of Adam Smith, is of the causes of improvement in the productive power of labor and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. Yeah, so I guess I can try to put it in a different word, in different words, right? It talks about what led to the increase in the productive power of labor, right? The different causes of this increase, and also how the fruit of labor, right, the produce, is distributed among different ranks of people. Okay. All right. Let's move on. The first chapter talks about the division of labor, and the key point is the division of labor is the greatest cause of its increased productive power. Let's take pin making for an example, right? So according to Adam Smith, making a pin back then requires the following process. You draw out the wire, right? You straighten it, you cut the wire, point the wire to make the sharp point, right? And you grind the top so that you can receive the head. And then there are 3 distinctive steps in just making the head, right? And and then after you made the head, you put it onto the pin, right? And then you whiten the pin, and in the end, you put the pin into a paper holder. And actually, the putting the pin into a paper holder itself is occupation at that time. So he mentioned that in a small shop of 10 people, right, they can make about 48,000 pins in a day. If every one of them only focus on a few of the operations mentioned above, right? And it's impossible for them to produce that many pins if every one of them make pins independently from start to finish. And I can share some personal experience related to that as well. I did an internship in Toyota many years ago. And during our training, the trainer had us make paper airplanes, right? So they hand out a instruction just like the picture shown here, right? Certain steps you need to follow to make the paper airplane. First, they had everyone make airplanes individually, right? And it's simple, right? We made some airplanes and we made them fly. And then the magic happened, right? They told us to do things differently, right? They had each and every person performing just one of the operation in making paper airplane. And then we worked as if we are on an assembly line, right? Once you complete one step, you pass the paper to the next person to complete the next step. And actually in this way, we produce about 3 times more airplane than if we were to make them individually, which is pretty impressive. And also talking about the assembly line itself. So from my what I observed in my internship on the moving assembly line, right? There are about a couple of workers responsible for a small section on each and every assembly line. And then that section is probably like 4 to 5 meters long, about the length of a car, right? And then as the car slowly moves on the assembly line, the workers perform some simple operations. So in each small shift is about 2.5 hours. and they work 4 shifts in a day, 4 small shifts in a day, making up the bigger shift. Yeah, so in every of these 2.5 hour shifts, they would perform about 2 to 3 operations at their spot on the line. Maybe it's easier if we have some pictures, right? So you can see, right, about 2 people occupying a certain spot on the assembly line, and then they would have some tools to help them, fasten some nuts or whatever. Um, yeah, doing just a few simple operations repeatedly in these 2.4 hours. And then in the next 2.4 hours, they may go to a different spot on the line and then perform 2 or 3 different operations for the next 2.5 hours. So it's very simple, right? It's not that hard to learn. So that's good for productivity, right? Because as people keep doing the same thing, they will get very good at it and then do it very fast. But it's actually not that good for their health. They usually fuck up their joints due to too many repeated motions. And I have a link to a video here. Right, just an example of an operation on the assembly line. You see him using a tool to hoist the entire door to the power body, and then fasten some nuts, right? And screw it in, put some cap, and then voila, done. The door is installed. That's just one example here. Okay, let's close this. Back to this. Okay. Yeah, so division of labor. Example. Okay. Now he start here. Let's go back to Adam Smith and the book, right? Then he move on to talking about. Then he proceeds to talk about the separation of trades. The separation of different trades seem to have taken place due to this advantage from the division of labor, and the separation is carried furthest in countries with the highest degree of industry and improvement. I think we can all relate to that, right? In the more backwards country, right, everybody kind of does everything, but then in the more developed countries, yeah, you kind of have to you pick an occupation and then you do that for most of your time, right? And he kind of explained why agriculture isn't progressing as fast as manufacturers. One reason being that the nature of agriculture does not admit so many subdivisions of labor, at least not so in his time, right? Because different sorts of work need to be performed in different seasons, right? In one season, you are the plower of the land and the sower of the seeds. And then in another season, you are the harvester, right? You do, they're just different things you needs to be done in different seasons, and it's impossible to be constantly employed in one of these things, right? So as a result, you kind of have to be a jack of all, right? You can't just focus on 1 or 2 things. And due to this limitation, agriculture wasn't progressing as fast as manufacturers, where it's a lot easier to have the division of labor. Advantages offered by the division of labor. Mainly 3 advantages, right? One is improved dexterity, right? Because if you keep doing the same thing over and over, of course you're gonna get better at it, right? Even if you're a dumbass, you will still get better at it. And then saving the time, right? Constantly lost in passing from one sort of work to another. I think we can all relate, right? When you just finish one thing and then you start doing another thing, in the beginning you're like, okay, where am I? How do I start? So on and so forth, right? And then only after a while you start to get into the groove, right? And then get the rhythm and start to pick up the speed. If you know computer science, you know the concept of a context switch, right? Once you switch to a different task, right, your cache is no longer hot, right? And then things take time, and then you build up the cache. Okay, now things are faster, and then you switch to another thing. Boom, the cache is useless again, right? So that's one advantage offered by the division of labor. You don't need to context switch that much. And lastly, the application of machinery, right? Invented by workman and philosopher. And one side note, looks like during that time, in Adam Smith's time, right? Philosophers seem to be referring to like scientists, philosopher, like pretty much anyone who like query into the nature of things, right? It's different from what philosopher means in modern day. Anyways, let's continue. Yeah, he mentioned that men are more likely to discover easier methods of obtaining object when they are focusing on that one object. And then just to show how far the division of labor is being carried in his time, right? He has given an example of a woolen cloth worn by the common folks, the working class people in England at that time, right? So as inconspicuous as this thing is, turns out it requires thousands, if not millions, of people's work to bring it to market, right? So first you need to collect the wool, right, and then prepare it to turn it into cloth, right? And that would require the shepherd to raise the sheep and cut the wool, right? And then there are the sorters of the wool, the dyers, the spinners, the weaver, the fuller, blah 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 blah, so on and so forth. And to dye the cloth, to color the cloth, right? You need dye, right? And to transport dye, from distant places, you need ships. So there are shipbuilders, sailors, sail makers, so on and so forth, employed in that aspect. And last but not least, to cut the wool, right, from the sheep, you need scissors. And to make the scissor, you need miners, right, to dig out the metal ores, right? And then you need a furnace, right, to melt the ore and then I guess extract the iron, right? So you need builder of the furnace, lumberjack to cut the wood to be burned in the furnace, so on and so forth. Not simple, right? Okay, so that concludes the first chapter. Let's move on to the second chapter of the principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. So what gives the occasion to division of labor? He explained the division of labor arises from a propensity, i.e. a tendency in human nature to exchange. And why do humans have the propensity to exchange, right? So he explained as such. So one thing, the propensity might be necessary consequence of the faculties of reason and speech. So as we get smarter, we start to get logical, right? We start to get rational. So we start to reason. Okay, I can't do everything myself. Can I use some of my surplus produce to exchange something that I don't have from someone else, right? And then that leads to a desire for communication, right? So speech helps with the communication and facilitates the exchange, right? But I guess it kind of goes hand in hand, right? As we speak more and invent more words, our expressive power improves, and then it's easier for us to communicate our own reason, our own desire, demand to others, and that facilitates exchange. And then when exchanging, right, you want to say certain things, but you don't have the words for it. What do? You make up the words. You make up words for it, and that in turn, right, enrich the language. So I guess it kind of go hand in hand, right? The desire to exchange and the development of speech. Anyways, let's move on to the second point. And I guess I can talk about it as well, right? So man is constantly in need of help from for other men, right? And he cannot expect it from their benevolence only, right? You can't be. Look how poor the beggars are, right? Because um, they 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 have nothing to offer but thanks in return for getting stuff, right? Uh, so you see the point, right? You have to give something to in return, right? Um, so that leads to exchanging. And yeah, lastly, the certainty of being able to exchange the surplus produce of his own labor for the produce of other man's labor, which he needs, and that encourages every man to focus on one particular occupation. And he mentioned the example of a bow maker, a person good at making bows, probably will get more meat by focusing on making bows and exchanging the extra bows for meat rather than make bow and hunt by himself. But this statement might be kind of questionable because later on in the next chapter, he explained that when the market extent is very small, it's hard to have very detailed, minute subdivision of labor. So I suspect there were that many bow makers the in the very ancient time when we were all hunter gatherers, right? So these are just some of my questions. Perhaps some of your audience out here may have more knowledge with regard to this. If so, please leave some comment. And I have some of my own theory regarding to the origin of the division of labor. I call it the aptitude and enjoyment theory, right? Because we can all relate, right? Sometimes we just enjoy doing certain things more than others, right? For example, I enjoy lifting and shooting more than most other people, right? And or some other people may enjoy drawing a lot more than other people. Or some people enjoy playing the guitar more than other people, right? Or some people are just naturally talented in things, right? Some people are just naturally good at math, right? Or some people are just naturally very good with words. Like for example, Eminem, right? Like rap god and so on, whatever. Yeah, so in the early time, right, when people were hunter gatherers, some people maybe may happen to be good at making huts, making a bow, or are just good at being hunters, right? And then perhaps a few smart people would realize that if they let these experts focus on what they are best at or what they enjoy the most, the whole community would benefit, right? Compared to if everyone just does everything. And then that maybe give rise to division of labor. But again, as would be mentioned in the next chapter, I suspect such division of labor is commonplace in the hunter-gatherer state of society. I think it might only happen later on. Okay, now moving on to chapter 3. The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So key point here being only when the extent of the market is large can the division of labor be fully carried out. And why is that? Now let's imagine a scenario, right? Say you live in a very small village in the middle of nowhere. And let's say you raise cows. Just example, right? You're raising cows, you're raising cattle. So you raise a shit ton of cows. You work your ass off, right? Um, And it turns out there are not that many people in your vicinity to consume the meat of this cow, right? Now, remember, this is not 21st century. You have convenient transportation. No, that was in the 18th century, right? Where transportation was a lot harder. So your extra meat, your extra milk, your extra butter and cheese, they cannot be sold. They're all wasted. You overwork yourself for nothing. So why the fuck would you focus so much, right, on just raising more cows, right? It doesn't make sense. So the two reasons being, uh, you don't have enough other people's surplus produce to sustain yourself. That's one thing, right? Because it's a small village in the middle of nowhere. There are not that many people. They don't produce that much, right? You cannot expect to just focus on one thing and then exchange your surplus with the produce of their labor. And another thing is, as I explained before, there's not enough demand for your own surplus produce to justify having just one occupation, right? So that's why it's only when the market is big you can have very detailed subdivision of labor. And there's an example he mentioned in the book, right? In some remote villages of Scotland, it's hard to find two smiths or two carpenters, right, within less than 20 miles of each other. So, or in other words, within 20 miles of vicinity, I guess, or I guess maybe 10 miles radius, you will only have one smith or one carpenter. That's how bad that is. Okay, so what extends the market? Water carriage widens the market. Why is that? Right. Let's imagine you're pushing a car. You're pushing a car, right? It will take quite a bit of force. But if you have ever rowed a boat, you will realize that moving the boat in water is so much easier than moving a car of the same weight on land, right? So water carriage is, on this account, a lot cheaper than land carriage because it requires much less labor. Smith give example, right? So between London and Edinburgh, the following two ways can carry and bring back the same weight of good in the same time period. A ship with 6 to 8 men versus 50 wagons attended by 100 men and 400 horses. You see, the cost of labor is so much greater in the latter, or so much less in the former, right? So water carriage provides accessibility, right, to markets that were inaccessible before, and also reduce the cost, right, of transportation, thereby widening the market. And then he moved on to talk about navigable rivers, right? It is upon the seacoast and along banks of navigable rivers that industries of every kind began to subdivide and improve itself, right? So he mentioned that the English North American colonies follow this pattern. And if we turn back, we look further back to the ancient civilizations, improvements first took place in Egypt. Now, one little comment. He forgot about the Sumerians, or maybe he knew but just didn't mention. But anyways, they are even earlier than the Egyptians. And then he mentioned the Bengals, right, with the Ganges and some other rivers, and the Chinese with Yellow River, Yangtze River, and a bunch of other rivers. Now, let's look at a picture, right? Early English North America colonies. You can see the colonies, right? In the 17th century. Yeah, so that's about 100 years before Adam Smith's time. Um, you can see they mostly are along the sea coast, and then whatever is more inland tend to be along river coast, right? So riverbanks. For example, look at the Hudson River, right? You see there are some settlements there, uh, and also some settlements along the Potomac River in Maryland, Delaware River as well. Yeah. And the ancient civilizations, right? Let's look at ancient Egypt. You see, like the settlements seem to be all along the Nile River, and then Indus Valley civilization, right? They are all around the Indus River. And he also commented on the Mediterranean Sea, right? So why during ancient time, we get so many prosperous settlements in the Mediterranean Sea? Well, because it's relatively smooth, I guess, compared to the Atlantic Ocean. It has many, many islands. I mean, just look at the Aegean Sea, how many islands there are, right? And then also, the Corsica, Sardinia, uh, Balearic Islands, Sicily, Crete, Peloponnesian, right? Cyprus, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Malta as well. Yeah, and also the proximity of neighboring shores, so on and so forth. These are all made it easy for ancient navigation and trading. And then when you have trading going on, people can satisfy each other's demand and everyone have a good time, right? Uh, but then he also mentioned Tartary. Tartary, I think it means modern day Siberia and Mongolia, maybe somewhere in Central Asia as well. Um, I guess just Northern Asia in general. So why is Tartary so fucking poor, right? He explained because these rivers they flow into the frozen Arctic Sea. So these rivers doesn't really help each other, right? So say you are on the river bank of river A and I'm on the bank of river B, I can't reach you through water because these two rivers flow into the frozen sea. And then, of course, the ship back then could not navigate through a frozen sea. Um, yeah, so that wasn't helpful. And also, the rivers are too far away from each other. And that's the same problem with rivers in Africa. They are too far away from each other. And Adam Smith also offered another perspective, I guess another reason why Europe was developing much, much further than Africa. Because you see the map of Europe, right? You have many inlets of water, you have many pockets of water here and there, right? If we look at the Mediterranean Sea, right? Um, it has many little it, it has many little pockets here and there, right? For example, the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Adriatic Sea, the Aegean Sea, right? And then the Aegean Sea is connected to the Black Sea, right? So many waters connected. So it facilitates the trade between distant places. That's like the southern part of Europe, right? And even if you look north, you get the Baltic Sea, the Northern Sea, the English Channel, so on and so forth, and you have a bunch of rivers flowing to these seas, right? These water bodies of water. So yeah, trading in Europe was made easy, right? But if you look at Africa, it's just one big chunk of land. um, there are not that many inlets of water, right? Not that many pockets of seas here and there. So of course, trading back then in the ancient time in Africa was a lot harder, and people are more isolated, market is smaller, development not as good. Okay, that's all for the first three chapters.